So what's the purpose of these cotyledon leaves anyway?
Guten gardening, everybody. Now, uppotting is an essential part of the indoor seed starting experience. And in today's video, I'm going to talk you through when we know it's time to uppot and our process for uppotting seedlings, because I've got a whole bunch that need to go to that next level in terms of the space their roots need. So let's go ahead and uppot some of these seedlings together.
Now, before I walk you through the uppotting process, I want to show you a couple of things. One, you see how nice and deep dark green these cucumbers are? Now, these are cucumbers from last year's harvest that we just saved the seeds from.
Well, we've not given any fertilizer, any food to these seedlings at all up to this point. I think that's important to note. The same is true for these Black Beauty zucchini. And it's not until we uppot that we typically start to give any fertilizer to our seedlings. And that should tell you just how much energy, how many nutrients are stored inside these to get that seed started.
And speaking of all of that energy, that brings me to what we call the cotyledon leaves. Now, you've probably heard people talk a lot
about a plant's true leaves versus these two leaves that form on a lot of our vegetables before anything else.
Well, these cantaloupe seedlings, I think, are a perfect example or a way for you to see the difference between the cotyledon leaves. That's these two leaves right here on this plant. They're kind of an oval shape on the cantaloupe. And then the true leaves that you can see are just starting to form here. Now, typically for us, when it comes to determining when it's time to uppot, we wait until we see the formation of the first true leaves, and then we know it's a good time to uppot. So I could probably wait a couple more days, but I'm going to go ahead and uppot these cucumbers as well, because I'm seeing the formation of these true leaves here. So what's the purpose of these cotyledon leaves anyway?
Well, a lot of times people will post pictures online of just those cotyledon leaves of a plant coming up and wonder, what is this that's growing? And the reality is it's kind of hard to tell what's growing until we start to see some of those first true leaves.
Although the cotyledon leaves, for example, on these broccoli do look a little bit different, so there is somewhat that we can tell from them. But the purpose of these leaves
is actually really important for the plant to start that process of photosynthesis. See, the cotyledon leaves are the embryonic leaves. They're inside the seed. They help the seed get started as they develop to become that plant that's going to work through photosynthesis. But you've probably also noticed that once the plant develops its true leaves, the cotyledon leaves that it started out with will wither and fall off.
And one of the main reasons behind that is that the cotyledon leaves are not nearly as good at photosynthesis as these true leaves. So they're not necessary any longer after the plant gets a good start for the plant to survive. And so they'll just wither and die. And these true leaves will take over the process.
Well, I hope that actually answered some questions that a lot of people have. I know that was one of the questions I had early on as my plants were developing. It's like, why are those leaves at the bottom falling off? Does that mean the plant isn't healthy? No, not at all. It's just part of the development process of the plant. Now, as I said, I don't think this is actually an exact science, but we do typically wait until we start to see some of those true leaves like we have here on the broccoli before we uppot. And I've talked to you about some of the containers that we uppot into, some of our newspaper pots, for example. I happen to have some of these little thin, flimsy plastic pots that we bought a couple of years ago that I'm going to continue to use now because I have them. I don't want to just throw them out, even though they're a plastic product. So I'm going to be uppotting just like I've done with this trophy tomato. I'm going to be uppotting into some of these for our plants here. So let's take a look at what our uppotting entails. All right, the potting mix that I'm going to be using is exactly the same as the potting mix that I started these seeds in. Now, the difference is that I could at this point add an all-purpose fertilizer for whatever the plant's needs were, something like a 5-5-5. But I'm actually not doing that for this group. Instead, I'm actually going to give these a liquid fertilizer made from our fish emulsion and our Moorbloom. So it'll be a nice balanced liquid fertilizer, which the roots can absorb really quickly. And I'm going to bottom water these seedlings once I've gone ahead and transplanted them. So they'll have plenty of food, plenty of nutrients, and again, it'll get to them even faster. I think that's going to create a really nice product. Let's take a look at the roots of these seedlings.
You can see the roots have been covered up by this solid dark color container for this setup that we've been using. So when I take this out though, it's a clear plastic and you can see the roots all in here. And honestly, I could have transplanted these a little bit earlier. They're not exactly root bound, but you can see the roots coming through the bottom here. And there are a couple that are at that point where you could almost consider it, well, I could consider this to be a little bit root bound. So we like to transplant our plants before that happens. You'll also notice that I have 2 in some of these. I planted multiple in each of these, and in most cases, 2 of them came up. So what I want to do here is be as careful as possible as I'm pulling these out so that I don't disturb the roots any more than I have to. Now, when I'm transplanting, I don't want to grab a hold here at the top and pull because I could separate the plant from the roots at the bottom. So instead, and I want to be really careful, especially with roots coming out, there's usually a little hole in the bottom. So there's a couple things you can do. You could try to squeeze around the sides to make it a little bit looser, or you can take a stick or something about that diameter and push through, and that's going to push the whole block of mix right out. I like to take a little piece of stick if I have one that's about that diameter and push really gently. I don't want it to fall out the whole way, but I've got that started out really nicely. All right, when it comes to transplanting, I want to disturb this as minimally as possible, and yet I have to separate the 2 plants here. The roots are kind of wrapped together. So what I typically do is just a gentle pull apart here as best I can. There we go, nice and gentle to separate. You know, some plants have more sensitive roots than others, so I want to be careful here. I want to get this into the mix or back into a mix as quickly as possible. And so I've created probably about 1 inch of depth here at the bottom of my container. I'm going to give it a little hole even so, and I'm going to let this sit right down in here because that wasn't so root bound or anything like that. I don't have to mess with the roots anymore. I'm just going to layer the soil mix around. And I want to keep this nice and vertical, so I am going to add a little bit of pressure here to the top. I'm going to pack it down a little bit. I guess that's a better way of saying that. And again, I want to keep that nice and upright for the plant to develop. And there's our first up pot. And now I'm going to get this one in again as quickly as possible. The process is pretty simple once you get started. I'm not trying to compact these roots too much. Again, I just want to create a nice vertical plant. Sometimes the plants grow a little crooked, and this is the opportunity to straighten things up a little bit so they're not falling over. There we go. I've got a bunch more of these to transplant, but that's our process. And now let me show you what I do if something is root bound. All right, these 2 I would consider to be more root bound, and it's not as bad as some you've seen where they're wrapping the whole way around, but you can see at the bottom how compact and tight all of this is. So I am going to have to mess with this a little bit as I'm pulling it apart, just like I did before. I just want to be careful here at the bottom as I'm separating it out. Sometimes I like to come in and try to loosen it up just like this. You see how it's coming apart here? Again, my goal is not to mess too much with those roots. I don't want to do any more or create any more trauma for the roots than I have to. I just need to be careful as I'm pulling it apart. There we go. Because the other thing that can happen if you're not careful, if you're pulling from the top and not the bottom here, is you could separate the plant from its roots altogether, and then you're not going to grow anything.
Now, of course, final plant size varies greatly depending on the plant that you're trying to grow. And so a zucchini seedling is going to be a lot bigger than, let's say, this Waltham broccoli. And this broccoli is just now developing its first true leaves. And I could probably wait another week or so on this broccoli. I've got 3 or 4 of our seedlings in each one of these cubes. But I do have to keep in mind that the roots in here don't have all that much space, especially when you're talking about multiple plants. So for something like this, I'm going to transplant this sooner rather than later. I'm actually going to be transplanting these here in the next couple of days to get them ready to go and up pot. If I wait too long to up pot, there's the possibility of stunting the overall growth of the plant, again, by stunting the root development. So I would rather, for most of my plants, err on the side of up potting a little earlier than waiting too long and having a problem with the roots at time of transplant.
Now, do keep in mind that depending on the plant type, and this is a Brandywine black tomato, this has been up potted for almost a month. It's growing by leaps and bounds. It's highly possible that before I get this plant outdoors, I have to up pot again to say a 5-inch container instead of this 3-inch container. So keep that in mind. It's okay. If they're growing big and you see the roots really starting to fill in, a lot of times you'll see the roots starting to come out the bottoms of the containers, go ahead, up pot again. I'd rather have a nice, really big plant ready to go and transplant outdoors than to limit the growth of the plant now. All right, here goes our fertilizer watering into here. It's pretty amazing how that one little container filled up this entire tray with healthy plants.
Well, folks, we have a whole bunch more up potting to do. We've got so many seedlings in here. In the next couple of weeks, a lot of this is going to start heading outdoors to be hardened off. But remember, that up potting process is an essential part of your seed starting indoors. Well, we hope you found today's video informative and useful and helpful. And if you did, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe. And most importantly, remember, when you're with us, you are good to grow.